Let's get into the story here about Steve Dozinger. I don't know if you guys have been aware, but there is an update in reference to his particular situation. So Steve Dozinger, obviously, he's been on house arrest because of his fight with Chevron. Now, he did sue Chevron. This is a big ordeal. The Supreme Court actually came down with the ruling yesterday, which is not good for Steve Dozinger. It's just the reality of the situation. But before we get to that particular update, I want to take you back just a moment to remind you of how he got here in the first place. You have to go back to this interview that he had with Democracy Now!, where he basically was the one that exposed Chevron, the Amazon oil spills that Chevron had, which also contaminated indigenous land, indigenous peoples, communities. And Chevron, this is a wealthy company. They're huge. And they didn't want to pay these people for the damages that they had done. Steve Dozinger, on the other hand, seems like he was the one who was more severely punished because they put him on house arrest for 3 years. Let's go back to that moment.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. If you'd like to get our daily digest, you can get it emailed by texting the word Democracy Now!, one word, to 66866. That's Democracy Now! To 6. Behalf of 30,000 Amazonian indigenous people for dumping 16 billion gallons of oil into their ancestral land in the Ecuadorian Amazon. 10 years ago, Ecuador's Supreme Court ordered Chevron to pay $18 billion. The landmark ruling was seen as a major victory for the environment and corporate accountability. But Chevron refused to pay or clean up the land. Instead, Chevron launched a legal attack targeting Donziger. Last month, a federal judge found Donziger guilty of 6 counts of criminal contempt of court after he refused to turn over his computer and cell phone. In an unusual legal twist, the judge appointed a private law firm with ties to Chevron to prosecute Donziger after federal prosecutors declined to bring charges. Today marks 2 years, 730 days since Steve Donziger has been in house arrest. Steve Donziger joins us from his New York home. We welcome you back to Democracy Now!, Steve. If you can start off by speaking about the trial that just took place. We talked to you right before the trial. You've since gone to trial and been found guilty. But talk about who prosecuted you and what the courtroom and the trial were all about.
Thank you, Amy, for having me. It wasn't a trial as trials are commonly understood. There was no jury. The judge who had already locked me up pre-trial, I'm the only lawyer in American history ever locked up pre-trial on a misdemeanor. I want to emphasize this is a misdemeanor case, a petty crime case, and I assert my innocence, but even if I were guilty, it's a very minor case. No one's ever been locked up pre-trial but me. So the same judge who locked me up now for 2 years, I haven't been sentenced to anything, is the judge who denied me a jury and alone decided my supposed guilt or innocence.
This whole script of right to trial by jury, this is a common misconception about the criminal justice system because the majority of people that are arrested actually don't have a trial. They don't end up having a trial. They take some type of a plea deal or they just sit there because they can't afford cash bail. It's a reality of the situation. A lot of people don't realize that. And so you start to talk to people that work in criminal justice. A lot of these people do not actually get a trial. It's crazy.
It was intended really to be sort of a show trial where a decision that had previously been made by the Chevron prosecutor, the Judge Preska, allowed a private law firm, Seward and Kissel, which has Chevron as a client, to prosecute me after the government refused to prosecute me. It was all just pre-cooked, and you kind of felt it watching it in the courtroom. During the trial, Judge Preska was reading the newspaper during witness testimony. All the main witnesses were Chevron lawyers. They testified that Chevron had paid them, Chevron private lawyers from a second law firm, Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher. Chevron had paid them $1,300 an hour and more to help the other Chevron private prosecutor try to convict me. It was all kind of run by Chevron. And the dangerous part about this, beyond the fact that my liberty has been deprived and I've been unable to work and help my clients in Ecuador and do my human rights work, is that this is a broader threat to our society. I mean,
it's like basically what Chevron did there, where it seems like a lot of them are on the payroll. Basically what they did there, that would kind of be like expecting Julian Assange to get a fair trial in the United States. Because we know that wouldn't happen, right?
We cannot allow in any rule of law country or any country private prosecutions run by corporations. It's just extraordinary. You know, if this were run by a normal prosecutor, the case never would have happened, or at a minimum, I never would have been, locked up prior to trial.
Well, I mean, the federal prosecutors refused to prosecute you. Is that right?
That's exactly right. What happened was, underneath all of this is the fact that I worked on a team of lawyers for years to hold Chevron accountable for the Amazon Chernobyl, this massive, deliberate dumping of cancer-causing oil waste down in Ecuador, where indigenous groups have been decimated. And Chevron wanted that trial held in Ecuador's courts, and we fought for 8 years against Chevron, won this big judgment in 2011. And rather than pay the judgment, they decided to try to demonize me and try to criminalize lawyering, criminalize human rights lawyering. They've had this plan for 10 years. We know for a fact, and they've admitted it, that way back in 2010, they went to the SDNY, which is the federal prosecutor in Manhattan, seeking to prosecute me for this supposed fraud in Ecuador, which is just hogwash. And they refused to prosecute me then. And, I kept going along with other lawyers to try to enforce the judgment against Chevron that we had won in Ecuador, which, by the way, has been affirmed by 6 appellate courts in Ecuador and Canada. I mean, this is a real judgment. And they then went back to this U.S. federal judge, Judge Lewis Kaplan, who's a former tobacco industry defense lawyer, and got him to demand I turn over my computer and cell phone and the electronic devices to Chevron. Again, no one's ever heard of such a thing in the middle of a litigation. When I appealed that order, he then charged me with criminal contempt of court for.
Okay, and that's how he got to where he is now, because he filed an appeal in reference to turning over his electronic device and his laptop, obviously. Which this whole thing to me was weird. I remember when the story, I first heard about the story, this was very strange to me. I'm like, why are they asking him to turn over things? And like nothing has even happened yet. It was very weird. So he was held in contempt of court because he didn't turn in those items. And so they basically put him on a house arrest, right? Now, just yesterday, this came by my way. And Stephen Dozinger tweeted this: breaking in a huge blow to the rule of law, the U.S. Supreme Court today let stand Chevron's prosecution and 3-year detention of me after helping indigenous people win the historic Amazon pollution case. Gorsuch dissented. Our Constitution does not tolerate what happened here. And so let's go ahead and look at this article. So you'll see there's Stephen Donziger, there's Roger Waters, and I believe that's Susan Sarandon there. Let's go ahead into the article because I do want to show you this is really crazy to me. The U.S. Supreme Court let Chevron foe Donzinger's contempt conviction stand. Let's go on. The U.S. Supreme Court on Monday declined to hear a disbarred environmental lawyer's challenge to his contempt conviction after he earlier won but was unable to collect a $9.5 billion judgment against Chevron over oil pollution in Ecuadorian rainforest. The court turned away an appeal by Stephen Donziger, who has argued that his prosecution violated his rights under the U.S. Constitution because private lawyers appointed by a federal judge handled the case against him after the U.S. Justice Department declined to do so. Donzinger's lawyers argued that this appointment violated separation of powers principles set out in the Constitution, delineating the authority of the three branches of the U.S. government. They maintained that the executive branch, not the judiciary, should have pursued any prosecution. The New York-based Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals last year concluded the U.S. District Judge Lewis Kaplan possessed the authority to appoint the prosecutors, who nonetheless remain subject to supervision by the U.S. Attorney General. Two members of the Supreme Court, 6-3 conservative majority, Justices Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, dissented from the decision to not hear the appeal, with Gorsuch saying that the Constitution does not tolerate what happened here. However much the district court may have thought Mr. Donziger wanted punishment, the prosecution in this case broke a basic constitutional promise essential to our liberty. And then it talks about how he shared this on Twitter. Donziger was sentenced to 6 months in jail in 2021 after U.S. District Judge Loretta Preska in Manhattan found him guilty of misdemeanor contempt for defying court orders arising from a lawsuit filed by Chevron. The Harvard Law School graduate had represented villagers in Ecuador's Largo Agrio region who sued Chevron for water and soil contamination caused by Texaco between 1964 and 1992. Chevron acquired Texaco in 2001. While not disputing that pollution had occurred, Chevron said the company was released from any liability because it paid $40 million for an environmental cleanup in the 1990s, and that Ecuador's state oil company, Petroecuador, was primarily to blame for the pollution. In 2011, an Ecuadorian court entered an $18 billion judgment that was later reduced to the $9.5 billion against Chevron for contamination resulting from oil production. And so this is where it comes in, where it says where Chevron then in turn sued Dozinger and others in New York, arguing that he and his associates had secured the judgment through fraud by arranging the ghostwriting of a key environmental report and bribing the presiding judge. In 2014, Kaplan concluded in that case that the Ecuadorian judgment against Chevron in Ecuador was obtained fraudulently through a corrupt process, rendering it unenforceable in the United States. And this is when it goes into when they asked him to hand over his documents, and he was held charged with criminal contempt. So I'm sure this is definitely not the news that he wanted to hear. I honestly think this is ridiculous. This guy's been on house arrest for a couple of years now. Just it's crazy times, man. Crazy times. But that is the update on that case, that the U.S. Supreme Court let Chevron foe Donzinger's contempt conviction stand. So very disappointed with the Supreme Court, obviously. Not good. Not good. That's right, Luz. Disgraceful. That's right. That's right.